Well, it was an end of an era at the Wallawang power station, stacking down yesterday. Now, it's one of the oldest coal-fired power plants in New South Wales in Australia, with the demolition changing the skyline forever. Now the site is set to become a renewable energy hub. And for more on this conversation, let's bring in Alia Armistead from the Australian Institute. It's great to have your company here today.
Good morning, thanks for having me.
Now, we saw these units blown up yesterday in some remarkable footage, I might add. And on the same day, the ABS energy stats were also revealed. So I guess, what does it show here, especially when it comes to coal?
That's right. So what it shows is that it's unequivocal that coal-fired power stations are being phased out. Coal-fired power stations around Australia have been bringing forward their closure dates, and the demolition of these units in New South Wales showed yesterday that coal-fired power stations will continue to be phased out. And the ABS energy statistics showed that renewables have increased 15% in the last financial year and will continue to put downward pressure on electricity prices, continuing to force coal out of the grid.
And as you did mention, this will turn into a renewables energy hub, which is a great move forward as Australia and many other countries plan to phase out coal. But we have heard the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison say that we will see coal remaining here for decades. So what do you think about that statement there, especially when it comes to pushing renewables?
That's right. So the COP26 Glasgow Agreement, which Australia did agree to, commits countries to phasing down coal-fired power stations. And renewables are by far the cheapest source of electricity, and the ABS energy statistics show that they will continue to reduce electricity prices in almost every state in Australia, and coal-fired power just can't compete with that anymore. So the Glasgow text really puts pressure on Australia to commit to what it agreed to in Glasgow by phasing down coal-fired power. And this is already happening all around the world as well. We saw the incoming German Chancellor bringing forward the expected coal closure date by 8 years and committing to 80% renewable energy by 2030. So Australia really does have a long way to go to catch up, but this transition is already happening.
And let's talk about COP26 for a moment. Now, we know Richie and Menno Quist from Oz Institute was over there. They were live in Glasgow. So what's the conversation been since they've been back? What is everyone saying about Australia's position on the table here? We've just, as you've mentioned, Germany's leading the way. They're bringing their target 8 years forward, and we're still saying that coal's going to be here for decades. So how does that sit with Australians?
I mean, it's very contradictory, really. Our Climate of the Nation has shown that Australians want action on climate change. They want coal-fired power to be phased out, and their preferred electricity source is renewable energy. So the Morrison government is really out of line with what Australians want and what we agreed to do at COP by committing to the Glasgow text. So this transition is happening, Australians want it, and it will be really interesting to see during the election campaign what Labor bring to the table on this.
And would you say that COP26 has really put more pressure, or I say, turn the dial even more on Australia to really accelerate the coal phase out?
Absolutely. And not only, we didn't bring a new target for 2030 to the COP negotiations, but the COP outcome this year will force countries to bring an updated ambition next year to COP27 in Egypt. So countries around the world are phasing out coal, and our coal does have demand overseas, but that demand will be reducing. So we can't be left behind in this transition. Countries are going to be reducing their demand for our coal, and domestically we're already seeing the transition happening without the Morrison government. So if we want this transition to be smooth, if we want to have stable energy and take care of communities that are dependent upon coal, then the Morrison government really needs to improve their policies and make sure that this transition can benefit everybody.
So let's touch on that a little bit further with the government's long-term emissions reduction plan, and I guess the modelling with that as well. Now, as you've mentioned, there is an accelerated focus that many people want to see when it comes to the coal phase out. A lot of people, a lot of sectors in Australia are still very reliant on it, especially when the Prime Minister says that it's going to be here for decades. So where do you think the gaps are really missing when we look at this model as a whole?
Yeah, so the Morrison modelling shows for the long-term emissions reduction plan that we will reach 85% emissions reductions by 2050. But we can do a lot better than that. And the real impetus on climate action is short-term action. So we need to improve our 2030 targets, and we need to invest in technologies that we know work today, like renewables and electric vehicles and battery storage, rather than investing in technologies like carbon capture and storage, which, despite being funded for decades, have not worked. And carbon capture and storage was promised to deliver clean electricity decades ago, and it has completely failed to do that. But the modelling shows that we will continue to invest in carbon capture and storage with the hopes that it will allow us to continue using fossil fuels. And this is expensive and unnecessary and a dangerous strategy, given that carbon capture and storage has not worked to date. Especially with things like hydrogen as well, we can't be investing in blue hydrogen, reliant on carbon capture and storage to make it a low emissions technology. When renewables are reducing in prices, we can have renewable hydrogen, and countries around the world will be lining up to buy our renewable hydrogen as well.
They definitely will. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Alia. Look forward to chatting soon. Definitely an open discussion here.
Thank you.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.